Hi, I'm Tim Mendees, and today I'm going to read you a story by the fabulous storyteller Callum Pearce. Lunch Break is taken from the combination anthology and cookbook Death Cuisine, which is out now from Breaking Rules Europe. You will find links and information below the video. This is Lunch Break by Callum Pearce.
Pick your bag up, faggot. Lee stumbled forward, reaching out to pick up his school bag from where his main tormentor, Craig Perkins, had thrown it. As he got close to the bag, Craig kicked it hard towards his younger brother Jonathan. The third tormentor, Ian Leach, just stood back and laughed, for the moment. He only ever joined in when the punches started flying. Ian was the muscle of this group, 15 and 14-year-old bullies. Craig, the ringleader, was a fairly good fighter himself, but he found it always helped to have a bit of extra muscle hanging around, just in case one of their victims got it into their heads to fight back. Fights were over quickly once Ian joined in. The big dumb idiot would just swing one of his large, meaty fists. Usually the person previously standing up to them would suddenly be lying down for them. "What's up, fag? You gonna cry?" Craig was laughing as he and Jonathan kicked the bag between them. Lee ran from one to the other, trying to scoop up his belongings and make his escape. He stumbled forward and fell to the floor in front of Craig. "Oh, look, little queer wants to give me a nosh." He grabbed Lee's head and shoved it into his crotch. "Loving that, aren't you, gay boy? You can't get enough." They had cornered him behind the school, where the bikes were locked up during the day. He tried every day to get his bike and get away before his three regular tormentors had met up and made their way there. They were always looking for trouble. This had become a daily occurrence, every lunch break or after school. He had never got on with Craig and his group of thugs. They had largely managed to stay out of each other's way until this year. Craig had one day decided that Lee was the new target. The gay taunts had nothing to do with his actual sexuality. Craig just used those words as a way to justify his actions to himself. This is surprisingly easy to do when you're a young man of very few brain cells. Lee had promised himself that the next time they tried to corner him, he would boot Craig hard in the balls and get away from him. This never happened. Lee didn't really have it in him to deliberately hurt someone. So instead, every day he was shoved around, pushed, punched, and tormented. Eventually, they would get bored, and he could go home and fantasize about the revenge he would take next time. "Stand up, faggot," Craig shouted. "Fight back, you fucking fairy." Lee stood up and closed his eyes, waiting for the first punch to hit him. Any minute now they would close in, throwing punches and kicks. "What's going on here?" Lee opened his eyes to see the staff entrance for the canteen was open, and one of the dinner ladies, Mrs. Williams, was standing there. She was angrily staring at the boys. "We're teaching this faggot a lesson," Craig shouted. "What are you going to do about it?" "You're Craig Perkins, aren't you? Is that Ian Leach? I'll be giving your names to the headmaster." "And fucking what?" Craig picked up the bag and threw it at Mrs. Williams. "Here, fag, the old bag's got your old bag." Lee was almost impressed. He had never seen anybody stand up to Mrs. Williams before. Dinner ladies were like royalty in English schools, Mrs. Williams especially. She could be very strict with most people. She'd always been nice to Lee, but he was very well behaved. Her grey hair was always pulled back against her head with a small bun on top. Her face was gaunt and stern-looking. Most normal people would crumble with just the right look from Mrs. Williams, but not Craig. He stared at her, daring her to say anything. She stared back, refusing to break eye contact until eventually even Craig had to give up. He turned and walked towards Ian and his brother. "See you tomorrow, faggot." He turned back to Mrs. Williams. "Hey, I may even come and try some of that fucking slop you serve in the canteen tomorrow. Maybe I'll show you how to spell my name for the headmaster, you old bitch." With that, they walked away, and it was all over for Lee again, until tomorrow. Are you okay? Mrs. Williams stretched out a bony hand to help him from the floor. I'm starting to get used to it, Lee said, standing and taking his bag from her. He's a very unpleasant young man, that Craig. You must stay away from boys like that. Believe me, I try to stay out of his way every day, but he always seems to find me at some point, Lee moaned. I'm not even gay. That doesn't matter. People like that will always find something to pick on people for. They think it masks their inadequacies. It doesn't, Lee smiled. Well, you get yourself home. I'll have a word with your year head and the headmaster tomorrow. With that, Lee jumped onto his bike and set off home. Mrs. Williams went back to cleaning the school kitchens. When Lee got home, he went straight to his room. He had ridden home in fear that Craig and his friends would catch up with him at some point and start the tormenting all over again. Luckily, this hadn't happened. Now, alone in his room, that fear turned to anger. He threw his bag across the floor. He was picturing their taunting faces, wishing he knew what to do to stop this being his life. Every single day, he imagined fighting back. In his head, he had all the best moves. Legs sweeping, fists flying. In his mind, he gracefully brought them all down and stood over their crumpled and bruised bodies, smiling as they writhed in agony. If only he was so swift and powerful in real life. He hadn't made many friends in school. This meant that most evenings were spent in his room playing games or dwelling on the events of the day. Lee barely spoke to his parents when he was called down for dinner. He just ate quickly, still thinking about Craig and his friends, knowing that they would be waiting for him again tomorrow. After dinner, he made some excuse about homework and went back up to his room for the rest of the night. Putting on his headphones, he lay on the bed, hoping the music would drown out thoughts of today and anticipation of tomorrow. Eventually he fell asleep, with the music still pumping in his ears. He felt wet leaves beneath his bare feet as he walked through the local park on a dark and foggy night. Ahead of him, he saw somebody else walking slowly, appearing and disappearing as they passed under the scattered lampposts dotted along the main path. He felt taller than usual as he closed the distance between him and the person in front of him. Striding closer, on legs longer than his own, he saw that the person walking slowly in front of him was Craig. His first instinct was to turn and run, but he didn't feel like he had any control over his body. Instead of turning and running, he grabbed Craig's shoulder and turned him around. As Craig opened his mouth to speak, Lee shoved his bony fist hard into his face. There was a loud cracking noise as blood poured from his victim's nose. Without any signal going from his brain to his body, the fist swung again, slamming into his already broken, bleeding beak. Craig slumped to the floor. Lee jumped onto him and punched him again several times. He had no idea where this strength was coming from. It felt as though he was occupying a far bigger, stronger body than his own, and he had trouble controlling it. Even though it worried him that he had no control over this body, the feeling of satisfaction was far more overpowering than fear or confusion. Seeing Craig lying there half-conscious in pain made him much happier than he was comfortable with. The hands were moving again now. Lee watched in horror as hands like claws ripped open Craig's shirt and started tearing at his chest. One hand pulled a knife from somewhere and sliced down the middle, and then the claw-like hands dug in and ripped the chest cavity open. He wanted to scream as the old clawed hands scraped chunks of flesh from the boy lying on the floor and forced them into his own face. He could feel all of the hot, wet flesh filling his mouth, tasting the coppery, salty taste of blood. Strands of raw flesh slithered between his teeth, making him want to throw up. Lee turned to gag and spit out the disgusting flesh that filled his mouth. Instead of seeing the leaves on the floor that he had expected, He saw that he was now kneeling on the floor in his bedroom, alone. No vomit came, so he climbed back into bed. He still felt the disgusting texture of the raw, slimy flesh in his mouth. He still experienced the pain and the sensation of warm, sticky blood on those larger, older hands. It took him a while to shake off the feelings from the dream. Hardest to shake off was his guilt at the satisfaction that he had felt whilst hurting the helpless victim. It gave him no small amount of pleasure to see Craig lying on the floor, taking the punches that he had so richly deserved. Even when the dream had taken a gorier turn, he couldn't get away from the idea that the little shit had deserved it. It made him feel good to imagine living in a world where bullying little bastards got their just desserts. Lee got ready for school slowly the next day. Flashes from the dream kept forcing themselves to the front of his mind until he pushed them back down. When not dwelling on the dream, his body was filling with dread. His heart beat faster, his stomach rolled. He couldn't stop thinking about running into his enemies again. He rode his bike slowly past the park on his way to school. He was almost expecting to see the scene from last night's nightmare. Blood, police tape, anything. But there was nothing. Everything seemed calm and normal. He knew it had been a dream, obviously, but a small part of him had held onto a tiny bit of hope there was actually some sort of premonition. Everything had felt so real at the time, and for long after he'd woken up. Somehow he managed to get to his first lesson without running into Craig and his friends. Now, as he waited for the register to be called, he could see that Craig's chair was empty. He thought for a moment again of the mutilated corpse lying on the ground in the park. In his mind, Craig stared up at him from the ground, his chest sliced open and face smashed. Shaking those images out of his head, he allowed himself to feel a bit of relief. If Craig was sick, Lee may have a couple of days without being harassed. The other two would be unlikely to start anything without being goaded by him. The day dragged, but he was enjoying the fact that he hadn't seen Craig or his ratty little brother all day. He had seen Ian at the lunch break, but he just looked lost and vacant, standing around on his own. He was nothing without the other two winding him up and shoving him in the direction of some poor kid whose turn it was to be tormented. He breathed a long sigh of relief when getting his bike at the end of the day to go home. A whole day without seeing that evil smirking face. After just one day without him, Lee already felt a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He rode home quickly and chatted happily through dinner with his parents. After his homework was done, he played on his games console in his room for a while. Eventually, he got into bed with a film playing on the TV. A picture of Jonathan, Craig's brother, flashed up suddenly on the television. Lee sat up, rubbing his eyes, and stared at the flickering screen. The scene changed, and he was watching somebody roughly his age. They were sat in a bedroom at a desk. Behind them, a tall hooded figure slowly crept up towards them. He stood up to look closer at the screen, but as he did, he found himself standing in the room he had just been viewing. There was a rope in his hands, and he was walking slowly towards the seated figure. When he was close enough that he was sure the boy in front of him would be able to hear him breathing, the rope went quickly around the boy's neck. Lee crossed the bony clawed hands of the body he occupied over, pulling the rope tightly as the boy tried to stand up. The lamplight showed it to be Jonathan, as Lee already suspected. The hands he had no control of were pulling the rope hard. Jonathan was clawing at it weakly and kicking against the wall behind the desk, trying to push the attacker away. This body was strong. There was no way the young man was going to be able to escape. Eventually, the legs stopped kicking. His hands fell to his sides, and his body slumped further into his chair. Lee, in the body he was occupying, dragged the boy from the room and down the stairs. His head banged loudly on every step. Somehow, Lee knew that nobody was home to be disturbed by the noise. Jonathan was dragged from the house and thrown into the boot of an old car. The boot slammed shut, and Lee woke sitting up straight in bed. He dropped the game controller he had still been holding. His hands ached as he felt the pain of pulling the rope so tightly and struggling with Jonathan. He was ashamed to admit, even to himself, that again he felt satisfied. He hadn't even fought against what was happening this time. He had passively accepted all of it, enjoyed every minute of it, was probably closer to the truth. He really hated those brothers. The idea of some monster picking them off was frankly delicious. He even wondered if somehow his own hatred of them had conjured some kind of terrible creature, a monster stalking the nights, wiping out his enemies. It was a ridiculous thought, of course, but when he thought of Craig's empty chair in school, he was a little bit excited. Arriving at school the next day, Lee was thrilled to see that Craig's chair was empty again. He thought about the dreams and wondered if there could possibly be something more to it. He knew that had to be highly unlikely. It could only really be a strange coincidence. Imagining never seeing either of them again was quite pleasant, though. The day was going along quite nicely until after lunch, when an announcement came out of the speakers around the school that there would be an emergency assembly in the main hall for his year. His heart jumped. This was highly unusual. Lee couldn't remember this ever having happened before. By the time he got to the assembly hall, everybody was mumbling and gossiping, everyone trying to guess what this strange announcement could mean. Nobody was without a theory, but they were devoid of any useful information until the headmaster walked out in front of them with a policeman. "Everybody settle down, please," the headmaster shouted a bunch above the mumbling, gossiping crowd. After a few attempts, people started to face forward to watch the two men standing nervously in front of them. "I know this is a little unusual, but I need you all to pay attention. We've had some very unsettling news about two young men who attend this school." The mumbling started up again. "Please, everybody, please calm down. There will likely be a reasonable explanation to all this, but it seems the Perkin brothers have gone missing." Lee's heart was banging in his chest. He could barely hear what was being said, as his hearing was being dulled by his rising blood pressure. The head teacher was saying that Craig had not returned home yesterday, and that the next night his brother had disappeared too. They assumed Jonathan had gone off somewhere following his brother and hoped that they would turn up soon. The children were told that if anybody knew anything, they would need to stay behind and speak to the policeman, no matter how small the detail. Anything that could give a clue as to the boys' whereabouts. After they had finished speaking, the crowd of children started excitedly chattering until the headmaster told them all to go back to their usual lessons. For the rest of the day, Lee couldn't think of anything much, other than his nightmares. He kept seeing the killer closing in on the boys and wondering if it was really possible to be seeing things through the killer's eyes. He even wondered if it was possible that he was committing the murders himself and somehow blocking it from his waking brain. There was never any evidence when he woke. No blood on his clothes or hands. No sign that he had left the room. The killer in the dream didn't feel like him either. The body he occupied was taller, and the hands were nothing like his. He knew, of course, logically, that it was unlikely that his dreams were anything more than a strange coincidence. The brothers had probably just run away from home. Craig probably left first, then his brother found out where he was and joined him. That seemed to be the theory the police had so far. It made a lot of sense. There had to be a reason that both the brothers had turned out the way they had. Usually, people who behaved as they did had problems at home. Assuming that to be true, running away was the likeliest scenario. The rest of the day went quickly as he dwelt on the thoughts of the boys and wondered about what could have happened to them. It couldn't be denied that even with the strange things that were happening, the atmosphere at school was far better without the Perkins brothers. At home that night, Lee struggled to fully work out how he felt about everything. He was happy not to spend the whole day in fear, waiting for Craig to appear shouting abuse. His day was far better without either of the brothers harassing him or encouraging their friend to. If he was truly honest with himself, he wasn't sure that he would feel too bad about it if he found out they were actually dead. As much as he hated to admit it himself, their deaths wouldn't be a bad thing for a lot of people in his school. They made so many people's lives a misery for their own entertainment. In fact, there were probably several people just in his school quite capable of killing them both. After dinner, he played on his games console late into the night. The idea of sleeping and dreaming again made him nervous, so he tried as hard as he could to stay awake. Eventually, his eyes started to get heavy, his limbs seemed to sink into his bed. Lee felt as though he was being pulled into his dream tonight against his will. One moment he was in his room, the next he was standing in a garden at night. He was looking at a small shed with a warm light glowing from inside. Walking slowly to the side of the shed, he peered into the window. Ian Leach was inside. He was carefully poking a hole into either end of an egg and blowing the contents into a bowl. Looking around the shed, Lee could see cases around Ian of many different types of eggshells. They were all carefully arranged in display boxes, each one labelled with the type of bird it came from. The bony, claw-like hands of the killer reached into the deep pocket in their coat and pulled out a hammer. Lee could feel the weight of it, as though the hands were his. He was walking against his will, around to the side of the shed with the door on it. Even though Lee knew what was going to happen, he had no way of stopping it. He didn't really have very strong feelings about Ian either way. If he wasn't encouraged by Craig and his nasty little brother, he would probably have never had any involvement with him at all. Surely killing those two was enough. He knew that it didn't matter how he felt about it. This was happening, and he would have to witness it. He threw the door open in this stranger's body and swung the hammer quickly into the back of Ian's head. He half expected it to crack open like one of his collected eggshells, but it was a dull, heavy thud. The hammer raised and fell again and again until Ian slid off his chair onto the floor. His eyes were still open, but Lee knew he was gone. As he leaned over the body, he tried to see his reflection in the eyes. The body he was inside didn't look at Ian long enough for him to get a good glimpse. It was already busying itself, pulling Ian out of the shed by his arms. The killer glanced a couple of times towards the house to see if anybody was peering out of the windows, and then dragged the body towards the gate at the back of the garden. Lee's alarm woke him before he could see any more. Images of all three boys filled his head, the violence of their deaths repeated on a loop. He needed to get to school and see if Ian had turned up. Lee dressed quickly, skipped breakfast, and ended up arriving at school half an hour early. He waited at the front of the school, watching to see if any of the three boys turned up. He didn't see any of them until it was time to go to his own form room for the register to be called. Craig's seat was empty again, but nobody so far was talking about Ian. Minutes seemed to take hours as he attended his morning lessons until about 11, when suddenly a girl at the back of his class jumped up and ran out of the classroom crying. Everyone was baffled until her friend looked at the phone she had been fiddling with before her outburst. The teacher saw the girl's face turn white as she read. He rushed over to take the phone from her hand. Now it was his face that the colour drained from, and he quickly left the classroom, possibly following the girl who had rushed out. Lee turned to see the girl at the back of the class, excitedly telling those around her what she had seen on the phone screen. "The police have found 3 bodies in the park, kids. It's got to be the Perkins boys and somebody else." She was both horrified and thoroughly enjoying being the centre of attention at the same time. She licked her lips as eager eyes stared at her from around the classroom. "Ritual murder suspected," it said. "Could be devil worshippers or witches or something." "Witches? Come off it," someone said from behind him. "Yeah, really. It says that they all had organs removed and a circle cut out of their stomachs." Lee's head was swimming now. He felt as though at any minute he could slump forward into unconsciousness. That relief didn't come. Instead, his head tormented him with scenes from his nightmares. When he felt less dizzy, he stood and walked quickly out of the classroom and headed outside for some fresh air. His heart was pounding, and his stomach was turning over as though it were full of worms. He gulped deep breaths of air and bent forward, trying to fight against his spinning head and stomach. When it didn't go away, he sat on the floor and carried on taking slow, deep breaths. There was no point going back to his lesson now. Everybody would be excitable and gossiping or upset and crying. He decided to stay where he was until nearly dinner time. Then he slowly walked towards the school canteen. He got there early and could see Mrs. Williams setting out the food on the counters in anticipation of the hungry students arriving. He realised he hadn't thanked her yet for the other day, so went over before the canteen would start filling up. "Excuse me, miss." Mrs. Williams turned and smiled happily at him. "I wanted to say thank you for the other day." "No need at all. I can't stand bullies." "Have you heard the news about the bodies being found in the park? I think it might be them," Lee blurted out more than he intended to say. "What makes you think that?" "Well, first, the brothers went missing, and then Ian didn't turn up for school today." "Could be a coincidence." Mrs. Williams looked worried, as it was clear Lee was starting to panic again. "I think I may have dreamed the murders." He had said it without thinking, as though, like in the dreams, he had no control over his body. "I dreamed all of them being killed, and then they weren't in school the next day. Now their bodies have been found, and everyone is talking about witches or devil worshippers." His voice was shaking as his mouth ran on autopilot. "A strong witch could certainly make you see through their eyes. Perhaps they felt it was something that you should witness." Her straightforward, matter-of-fact tone cut through any doubt and uncertainty even before they could form in his mind. She was talking about witches as though they were just an everyday problem around these parts, and he didn't even question it. "They all had body parts removed." "Yes, I heard on the radio earlier." He glanced at her bony, claw-like hands as she started to pull out the trays of hot food. People were starting to file into the canteen, waited to get their dinner, so he stepped out of the way a little bit. "Liver, heart, and a chunk of their stomachs, I heard," she said. For a moment he thought he saw bruises on her knuckles, but they faded before his eyes. His imagination was clearly playing tricks on him. "Sounds like somebody turned them into the thing they hate the most," she grinned. "What? Gay?" Not quite." "Ew, miss, what's that?" A girl at the front of the newly formed queue pointed to a tray with meatballs and gravy in it. "Faggots, dear. An old English dish. Now don't be childish, don't snigger. It was a dish long before it was a diss." Lee looked in horror at the tray of food and back at Mrs. Williams's smiling face. "They're just meatballs made with offal. Very tasty and very good for you." "What do you mean, offal?" the girl asked. She was already sure she wasn't going to like the answer. "What, in these? Heart, liver, and a little bit of fatty stomach meat. It tastes much better than it sounds." "Ooh, no thanks. I'll just have the chicken." The girl shuddered dramatically as Lee stared at Mrs. Williams. She was happily carrying on with her work as the pieces of the puzzle slowly fitted together into Lee's head. She looked over at him and smiled. Must be a relief, hey? Knowing that you've seen the last of them. But they're dead. It's probably for the best. He remembered the strength he had felt occupying her body. It was hard to believe that the old woman standing in front of him was capable of such violence. Now people were queuing up to take a plate full of his tormentors, unknowingly munching into the people who had made his life a misery. He needed to warn them, to say something. No way could he watch them tucking into the dinner, knowing what he knew. All of those people that, in all his time at school, had never really bothered to get to know him. All of those who walked past him when he was being pushed around by the bullies. He felt relieved every time somebody chose the chicken dish, but horrified to watch the tray of faggots emptying quickly. But he did nothing. "Are you doing okay there, young man?" Mrs. Williams asked. Lee hadn't moved from the counter. He was just watching in horror as people on different tables tucked into their terrible dish in front of them. When he saw somebody taking a bite out of the large, disgusting-looking meatballs, he remembered the feel and taste of Craig's raw flesh in his mouth. "Aren't you worried you'll get caught?" Lee asked when Mrs. Williams had finished serving people and stood next to him on the other side of the counter. Witches don't get caught. Besides, whatever they are looking for, it certainly isn't going to be a frail old dinner lady, is it? You won't say anything, would you?" "No, of course not. No. Well, who would believe me anyway?" "Precisely." She picked up a chip and ran it through the gravy left at the bottom of the faggot tray. "I don't know about hot or cold, but I find revenge is a dish best served with chips." Lee was surprised to find himself laughing along with her as she chuckled at her own terrible pun. They both smiled as they watched the school kids happily scoffing down gravy-covered lumps of the group of bullies.